Introduction. Falun Gong is a religious cult which originally emerged in China in 1992 as a Qigong practice and was supported by the Chinese government for years. However, in 1999 it became targeted by the Chinese government for suppression due to its leaders' failure to cooperate with government requirements for Qigong movements and government fears that the movement, which had now developed into a religious cult, might have disproportionate social influence on the population. By this time, its leader, Li Hongzhi, had moved to the US, where he established a multimedia group called Epoch Media Group to continue spreading his teachings and defend the group from criticism. Epoch Media quickly gained a very large viewership, and with the advent of YouTube in 2005, the organization started moving into social media, where its presence has become massive. Although Western media was initially sympathetic to Falun Gong's defense of itself, Epoch Media's behavior started to become questioned as more information about the cult's right-wing conservative teachings was exposed. In 2016, when Epoch Media threw its huge resources behind Donald Trump in an effort to support his election, and began openly promoting right-wing ideology, pseudoscience, and outright conspiracy theories, it became clear that neither Epoch Media nor Falun Gong were as innocent as they had previously seemed. This video describes the way in which Falun Gong has used Epoch Media Group to promote its own anti-progressive apocalyptic theology, as well as conservative right-wing ideology, and attempted to influence US politics, covering these topics. 1. Falun Gong's Epoch Media Group. 2. Falun Gong's right-wing teachings. 3. Falun Gong's defense of its teachings. 4. Epoch Media's support for Donald Trump. Use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the content. Falun Gong's Epoch Media Group. In 2000, the Falun Gong organization formed Epoch Media Group, based in the USA, for the specific purpose of spreading propaganda defending Falun Gong and attacking the Chinese government. Ever since then, Epoch Media Group has continued to extend its presence across a wide range of traditional and new media channels, which it either owns or is affiliated with, typically without identifying its connection to them. An NBC article on the 20th of August 2019 explains, quote, "Despite its growing reach and power, little is publicly known about the precise ownership, origins, or influences of the Epoch Times. The outlet's opacity makes it difficult to determine an overall structure, but it is loosely organized into several regional tax-free non-profits." End quote. The article also mentions that such opacity is a deliberate strategy, explaining that the Epoch Media Group is, quote, "a private news and entertainment company whose owner executives have declined to name," end quote. However, in lectures to his students, Falun Gong leader Li Hongzhi is explicit about the relationship of Epoch Media Group to both Falun Gong and its other organizations. In a lecture in Houston on the 5th of September 2010, Li identified the radio station Sound of Hope, as well as the newspaper Epoch Times and the new Tang Dynasty television network as, quote, "our media," end quote. At the same conference, Li also commented on the importance of diminishing the visibility of Falun Gong's connection to its own media, saying, quote, "some of our media give no thought to what they're doing and always put Falun Gong out front. The Falun Gong Epoch Times, the Falun Gong New Tang Dynasty TV, the Falun Gong this, Falun Gong that. Some students just insist on doing that when in fact they don't need to," end quote. Li then acknowledged, quote, "and actually, even if you didn't say that, people would still know. Many people know that the Epoch Times is run by Falun Gong students," end quote. However, he also told his followers that anyone insisting on identifying transparently the relationship between Falun Gong and its media was serving the interests of Falun Gong's enemies, saying, quote, "but do you realize all that talk about people supposedly saying that if you don't put Falun Gong out front, you'll have this and that issue, was in fact something that was spurred by secret agents of the Wicked Party," end quote. Li added that the Falun Gong members running the organization's media, quote, need to think about how to better cement the position of our Dafar disciple-run media as part of society and become regular media in ordinary society, end quote. Explaining, quote, if the media that our Dafar disciples run become very credible in people's eyes, these will have much more power in clarifying the truth, end quote. So it's very clear Li regards concealing Falun Gong's connection with its media as more important than revealing the connection, and that his aim is to improve the credibility of the organization's media by giving it the appearance of, quote, regular media, end quote. The credibility of Falun Gong's media in Western countries is of particular importance to Li. At a later conference on the 27th of October 2018, he not only confirmed that Epoch Media Group, quote, includes New Tang Dynasty, end quote, but was, quote, steadily becoming more recognized and valued by the Western world, end quote, which he characterized as, quote, really heartening to see, end quote. Falun Gong's right-wing teachings. As a new religious group and a syncretism of Qigong, Taoism, and Buddhism, it could be expected that Falun Gong would have some unusual teachings. However, Falun Gong doctrine seems to have become increasingly more radical over time, especially after the movement became cultish. Falun Gong's leader, Li Hongzhi, regularly addresses his followers in person at various locations. During these meetings, he delivers his teachings and answers questions from attendees. Many of these meetings are recorded on the official Falun Dafa website in the form of English translations, and reading them provides direct insight into Li's formal teachings. Some of them are unusual but basically harmless. For example, at a meeting in Switzerland on the 4th of September 1998, a student asked Li to explain his teaching, quote, that the moon was constructed by the humankind of a remote age, end quote. Li confirmed that this was correct, adding, quote, people at one time recognized the trouble that the dark of night caused people, so they constructed a moon up there to bring light to Earth during the night, end quote. However, other teachings are not so benign. Some of them have an obviously violent and apocalyptic tone. At the same conference, Li asked, quote, what really is the CCP? Wouldn't it be none other than the beast at the end of days that all of those prophecies and religions have talked about throughout history, end quote, adding, quote, and doesn't it seek to destroy humanity? We see it for what it is, of course, end quote. Falun Gong's teaching that the Communist Party of China is a great evil threatening the world is no secret, but what is less well known is the teaching that this great evil will one day be destroyed in a global war, which will also annihilate Falun Gong's enemies. Over time, Epoch Media Group became increasingly allied to right-wing political groups, which were an ideal match for the highly conservative and authoritarian teachings of Falun Gong, the teachings of which are, in the words of a 2021 paper by Xinjiang Jiang and James R. Lewis, quote, homophobic, anti-misogynist, anti-feminist, end quote. Their paper, which describes and analyzes, quote, the harshness of Li Hongzhi's frequent pronouncements against gays, race mixing, and the like, end quote, demonstrates how closely aligned Li's formal religious teachings are with traditional conservative right-wing ideology. One of Falun Gong's most dangerous teachings is the claim that physical sickness is the product of karmic impurity, which can only be resolved through spiritual means, dissuading followers from seeking actual medical treatment. The number of Falun Gong followers who have died due to refusing modern medicine is so significant that Li himself has acknowledged it, saying as early as the 5th of September 1998 conference, quote, there have been quite a few instances of sickness karma tests, with many people even passing away, end quote. However, he attributed this to people failing to follow his teachings correctly and to spiritual malaise caused by holding, quote, many attachments deep inside, end quote. Other Falun Gong teachings are more traditionally conservative. At the same conference, Li was asked, quote, why is homosexuality considered immoral, end quote, to which he replied, quote, think about it, everyone. Is homosexuality human behavior? Heaven created man and woman. What was the purpose? To procreate future generations. A man being with a man, or a woman with a woman, it doesn't take much thought to know whether that's right or wrong, end quote. The dehumanizing consequence of this teaching was demonstrated by Li's further words, quote, "When minor things are done incorrectly, a person is said to be wrong. When major things are done incorrectly, it's a case of people no longer having the moral code of human beings, and then they are unworthy of being human," end quote. Later, the question was asked, quote, "Why is it that homosexuals are considered bad people?" End quote. To which Li replied uncompromisingly, quote, "Let me tell you, if I weren't teaching this far today, God's first target of annihilation would be homosexuals. It's not me who would destroy them, but God's," end quote. Falun Gong's transphobia was also exhibited at the same meeting, when Li catalogued what he saw as the evils of modern society, saying, quote, "If you look at today's society, you can see that drug use, drug trafficking, drug making, sex changes, homosexuality, sexual freedom, organized crime, etc. emerge in an endless stream," end quote. Li also spoke out against what he regarded as race mixing, claiming, quote, "Sexual freedom, which has mixed the human races and muddled human ethics, is absolutely forbidden by gods," end quote. Li regards this teaching as not only a divine commandment, but a true representation of original Chinese culture, which he believes to be morally superior to the West. At the same conference, he explained, quote, "You all know that Westerners don't understand why Chinese people are still so reserved when it comes to relationships between men and women. Let me tell you that this is how humans should be," end quote. This fundamentalist moral conservatism, wrapped in the morality of traditional Confucianism, is at the bedrock of Li's ethical system. In contrast to the triumphalist narrative of China's government, Li claims modern China has lost its way, backsliding into moral and ethical decline as it moves further from its traditional values. He sees modernity as a moral enemy and insists on the revival of historic Chinese socio-cultural conservatism, complete with patriarchy, social hierarchy, xenophobia, homophobia, and Han chauvinism, the racist belief that the Han Chinese ethnic group are exceptional in human history and essentially superior to all other ethnic groups. It should be noted that this is not why the Chinese government opposes Falun Gong, since a number of these views are not only perfectly acceptable in China, but actively promoted by the government, especially homophobia, transphobia, social hierarchies, and xenophobia. Han chauvinism in particular is a belief which Mao himself combated seriously, but since then the government has typically given little more than lip service to opposing it, despite being fully aware of its dangers. When teachings such as this are viewed in combination with Li's authoritarian and dictatorial management of Falun Gong, the personality cult which he has developed in order to center the entire organization on himself, and his promotion of a palingenetic ultranationalism which seeks to return China to a mythical historic past of greatness and cultural purity through a seismic social rebirth, it's no exaggeration to say Li has much in common with simple fascism. It should be noted that the Chinese government itself has sought to capitalize on the vast gulf it observes between official Falun Gong moral teaching and the ethics and morality considered acceptable in many Western countries. In a 2009 article entitled "Conflicts Between Falun Gong Teachings and Western Moral and Ethic Principles," the Consulate General of the People's Republic of China in Chicago wrote, quote, "Falun Gong originated from China and has been spread to many countries. Its founder, Li Hongzhi, has made many remarks totally incompatible with Western public moral and ethic principles," end quote. Note that this government-sponsored article ironically says nothing about Li's remarks being totally incompatible with Chinese public moral and ethical principles. The aim is to convince potential Western supporters of Falun Gong that it would be hypocritical to support the cult by revealing the extent to which its official teaching is an outrage and offense to Western sensibilities. There is a lot more which could be said here, given what this reveals about the morality and ethics which the Chinese government regards as Western. The distinction between so-called Western values and Eastern values is made very strongly in Asia, where descriptions of the differences between the two value systems are rarely in favor of the West. Those of us who lived through the 1990s, the era when so-called Asian values were elevated to a political ideology in nations such as Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China will understand that one of the key distinctions made by proponents of the ideology is that while Western values are based on universalism, the idea that certain moral and ethical principles are universally true and should apply everywhere to everyone, Asian values are based on the idea that moral and ethical principles are culturally relative, so that instead of human rights being universal, they emerge locally and organically from distinct regions and are not universally applicable. This is used to uphold the related idea that while so-called Western values are valid for Western societies, they are invalid in, inapplicable to, and unnecessary for Asian societies, which have their own values. This view is still dominant in the Asia-Pacific region, but that's a subject for another video. Falun Gong's defense of its teachings. The Falun Dafa Information Center website contains an article written in 2008 attempting to defend its teaching against criticisms. The counter-arguments typically take the form of acknowledging what the teaching says, while minimizing its significance or making an effort to distract from it. The article acknowledges that, quote, with regards to sexual ethics, Falun Gong holds traditional values similar to the teachings of Buddhism or Christianity, end quote, adding that Falun Gong, quote, stipulates that sexual relations should only occur in the context of monogamous heterosexual marriage, end quote. This is an acknowledgement that Falun Gong forbids anything but monogamous heterosexual relationships. The article attempts to mitigate this fact by stating, quote, however, we make no attempt to impose these views on others, certainly not to non-practitioners, end quote. But this doesn't change the fact that Falun Gong practitioners are urged strongly to reject sexual relationships outside this strict paradigm and face peer pressure to conform. Nor does it change the fact that Falun Gong teachings condemn other sexual relations in terms which are so strong as to diminish, demean, and even dehumanize those engaged in them. The article continues, quote, at the same time, we never exclude anyone from joining our practice. On the contrary, we welcome everyone, regardless of their sexual orientation. Falun Gong practitioners respect every individual's freedom of choice and have never opposed the LGBTQ community or any efforts to establish their rights, end quote. This does not change the fact that Falun Gong teaching denies salvation to people who enter what are regarded as illicit sexual relations and insists they are morally deviant non-humans. In a conference in Houston on the 12th of October 1996, Lee stated explicitly that in order to become acceptable to the gods, gay people must, quote, stop doing those filthy things, end quote. When a student asked, quote, can homosexuals practice dafa, end quote, Lee answered, quote, yes, but they have to correct this bad behavior, live nobly and upright like a human being, find themselves and break out of that dark state of mind, end quote. So the Falun Gong article is very misleading when it implies that the organization does not seek to modify anyone's behavior in this regard. The article also claims that Lee's condemnation of race mixing are only, quote, in one Falun Gong lecture, end quote, and interprets them as saying, quote, different ethnicities, while all spiritually equal, have different divine origins, each claiming their own heavens with which they have a corresponding relationship, end quote. The article attempts to diminish the importance of this teaching by saying it is, quote, extremely tangential, end quote, and, quote, not part of Falun Gong's core teachings at all, end quote. However, this is not how Lee himself presented this teaching, nor was it confined to one lecture. In fact, it was obviously taught very early, since there is a record of a student asking Lee about it during a conference in Houston in 1996. At that time, Lee insisted on the real existence of distinct racial groups, saying, quote, white people are white people, black people are black people, and people of the yellow race are people of the yellow race, end quote. He further explained, quote, after mixing blood, people no longer have their correspondence to the divine beings in the heavens, and then it is possible that none of the divine beings that created humans will take care of them. Then, with regard to these people, they are very pitiable, end quote. 2 years later, in 1998, Lee repeated the same teaching in another lecture, and ex-members of Falun Gong have confirmed it is still current doctrine. In a conference at Frankfurt on the 30th of May 1998, a student is recorded as saying to Lee, quote, I have a Chinese girlfriend. Through reading the books, I know it's not right to have an interracial marriage. I decided to break up with her, end quote. Li clarifies, quote, I've never said no to your wish to marry someone of a different race, end quote, but nevertheless continues, quote, all those who are to remain on the earth in the future have to be full-blooded, end quote. So while it's true that Falun Gong does not exclude so-called interracial people from its ranks, it still insists that only so-called full-blooded people have an opportunity for true salvation. The Falun Gong article claims that this teaching, quote, can only be understood in light of Falun Gong's teachings about the reincarnation and the transmigration of the soul, end quote, noting that Falun Gong teaching says, quote, a person may reincarnate into a Chinese family in one lifetime and into a white, black, or interracial family in another, end quote, adding, quote, far from encouraging racism or discrimination, these teachings actually discourage it, end quote. But this reincarnation into different ethnic groups doesn't change the fact that Falun Gong's teaching explicitly condemns what it calls race mixing, insisting that it is the product of aliens interfering with humans, says that true salvation can only come to those who are so-called full-blooded, and consequently regards so-called mixed people as, quote, pitiable, end quote. Epoch Media Group's support for Donald Trump. Given these reactionary views, it was no surprise when Epoch Media Group threw its support behind Donald Trump in 2016, viewing him as a potential ally in Falun Gong's fight with the Chinese government. Not only was Trump just as anti-China as Falun Gong, his conservative, anti-progressive, racist, right-wing ideology was in harmony with Falun Gong's teachings. To this point, Falun Gong had generally been treated fairly positively by international media, which took a skeptical view of the Chinese government's accusations. Western media in particular objected to the government's suppression of religious freedom. However, once it became clear that Falun Gong was attempting to influence the US political system, and in particular to support the election of a right-wing presidential candidate, international media, including several media outlets in Asia, started sounding the warning. From at least 2018 onwards, Western media has been tracking and exposing Falun Gong's right-wing propaganda, and in particular its enthusiastic promotion of Trump. Here are just a few examples from the last couple of years. In October 2019, an NBC article entitled Trump, QAnon and an Impending Judgment Day, behind the Facebook-fueled rise of the Epoch Times, observed that, quote, the Epoch Times now wields one of the biggest social media followings of any news outlet, end quote. The article also identified the Epoch Times' support for Donald Trump, saying it had, quote, spent more than $1.5 million on about 11,000 pro-Trump advertisements in the last 6 months, end quote, which it noted was, quote, more than any organization outside of the Trump campaign itself and more than most Democratic presidential candidates have spent on their campaigns, end quote. The article explained Epoch Times advertisements, quote, peddle conspiracy theories about the deep state and criticize fake news media, end quote, observing, quote, the Epoch Times looks like many of the conservative outlets that have gained followings in recent years, end quote. The article also identified 2016 as the year when Falun Gong became active in US politics, commenting, quote, before 2016, the Epoch Times generally stayed out of US politics unless they dovetailed with Chinese interests, end quote, before adding that its later pro-Trump advertising, quote, has doubled the Epoch Times revenue, end quote. Over the next couple of years, a number of articles appeared in a range of media outlets making the same observations of Falun Gong's activity. In October 2020, an article in the New York Times noted, quote, since 2016, the Falun Gong-backed newspaper has used aggressive Facebook tactics and right-wing misinformation to create an anti-China, pro-Trump media empire, end quote. In January 2021, a BuzzFeed article with the title, quote, this pro-Trump YouTube network sprang up just after he lost, end quote, reported, quote, a group of channels connected to the Epoch Times is pumping out hoaxes and lies without identifying their connections to the right-wing newspaper, end quote. In April 2021, an article in The Guardian entitled Falun Gong-aligned media push fake news about Democrats and Chinese communists advised, quote, the Epoch Times, believed to be linked to the Chinese religious movement, is part of an anti-CCP influence operation tapping into the US right, according to a media watchdog, end quote. Conclusion. Importantly, Falun Gong's media propaganda wasn't simply restricted to defending itself from the Chinese government, promoting right-wing values, and supporting Donald Trump, nor was it simply aimed at shifting public opinion and politics in the US. An article published in The Atlantic on the 13th of January 2021 appropriately describes the Epoch Times content as a, quote, singular mix of straight news, religious belief, conspiracy peddling, sinophobia, science denialism, legitimate grievance, and political expediency, end quote. At first, it seems as if Falun Gong are attempting to build an audience by throwing absolutely everything at the wall to see what sticks. However, on closer inspection, the common threads of these stories become very clear. The magical thinking of Falun Gong's traditional Chinese Qigong teaching, Falun Gong's conservative right-wing religious teachings, Falun Gong's conflict with the Chinese government, and Falun Gong's desperate desire to seek alliances with anyone remotely sympathetic with their aims. Consequently, it's no surprise that they enjoy particularly strong support from racist right-wing conservative Christians in North America, whose grasp on science, geopolitics, and reality in general is particularly loose. According to a March 2022 article by the Open Democracy website, Epoch Media Group has a global reach, quote, published in 21 languages in 33 countries, end quote, through which it is spreading conspiracy theories such as anti-vaccination misinformation. In the next video in this series, we'll look in detail at the various channels through which Epoch Media spreads these messages, including a wide range of YouTube channels, most of which conceal their connection with Epoch Media and Falun Gong and attempt to represent themselves as belonging to independent parties.